Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. Welcome back to the channel and to my humble home studio. I've been producing music for well over a decade now, and in that time I've accumulated quite a bit of gear and quite a wide selection of plugins. In fact, I went through my entire plugin list, checked my receipts and the prices online, and I've spent somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 Canadian dollars on plugins throughout my lifetime. And while I try to maximize all of the hardware and software I bring into my studio, there are a few select plugins that I keep going to time and time again in each of my projects. So I wanted to share those plugins with you. There are 30 of them. It might be quite a long video. I've added timestamps in the video in case you want to jump around. But my hope is that by sharing my favorites with you, I can help you make decisions as to what will benefit your home studio situation in terms of plugins. There's a lot of marketing in the plugin industry, and if I can save you some time, effort, and especially money in optimizing your studio, then I'll feel good about that. So I've got 30 of my favorite paid plugins to show you here today. I will show you how I go about using them. This will not be a detailed demo on any particular plugin. That would take way too long, although I may opt to do that in the future on each individual plugin. Rather, I want to give you a brief overview of each of these plugins and why I like to use them so much. I will be focusing on processes and effects in this video and staying away from virtual instruments, although I may very well do a video on my favorite virtual instruments in the future. Another thing to note is that these are all third-party plugins. I do have a video going into my favorite stock Logic Pro X plugins. I will leave a link to that video in the description box down below. And this is going to be a longer video, and so I put timestamps in the description box down below. They should show up on the timeline of the video. So if there's any plugins that speak to you and excite you, you can jump around to those specific plugins if you'd like. So without further ado, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started talking about my 30 favorite paid plugins for music production. All right, the first plugin I have to share with you today is Celemony's Melodyne. This is a super powerful pitch correction software. It works on monophonic and polyphonic instruments really well. I've used Auto-Tune, I've used Flex Pitch here inside of Logic Pro, I've used Waves Tune and a few others, and Melodyne has been my go-to since about 2015. I just like the interface, I like how it works, and I like how powerful it is. This version is Studio 5, although there are other versions. I opted for the top of the line because I wanted the ARA, or the audio random access. So if your digital audio workstation allows for ARA, I would highly suggest going for an upper version. And the Studio also allows for polyphonic tuning. So that's why I chose that one. But this is still a super powerful pitch correction software, particularly for vocal production, even in the lower editions. So for this demonstration, I don't actually have Melodyne running with ARA. I would have to run Logic in Rosetta as I'm using an M2 Max chip rather than an Intel processor. And if you wanted to use ARA, you would have to make sure that your DAW is actually compatible with it. But when we aren't using that, we would go to Algorithm right here and go to Set Default. And where I'm running this on the vocal lead right here, I'm going to set the default to melodic. So that's going to automatically read the audio as if it's monophonic. We can also go down, set default to a polyphonic version. But because we are running this on the lead vocal, I'm going to set it to melodic. And then I'm going to hit this transfer button and record audio into it. I'm just going to do a little snippet for the demonstration purposes of this video. I don't want to make it too long.
All around us is the drug takers playing with the soul shakers, one for all. Y'all thinking you're different, you are all the same. If I'm getting twisted, pull it, pass it.
There we go. And again, if I was using the ARA, it would have recorded the entirety of the audio track right here. So I'm using the Vox lead. If we zoom in, it's all of this information. So we just have this little bit right here. You see that it is synced to the timeline. So if I scroll over, it actually scrolls inside Melodyne. And then what we can do is correct the pitch. So these blobs are effectively the words or the syllables, and then the red line right here is the actual pitch. So you notice a lot of variation at the beginning of words. That's the transient information of the word. We don't necessarily want to tune that, but we will often want to tune the majority of the words. So what I like to do is select short sections, go here to the correct pitch macro, and I'll often just pitch center this 100%. I like working in chromatic mode, although right here you see A major. If I was to snap to chord scale, that would snap these notes to A major. So you see A, G sharp, which would be the major 7, F sharp, which would be the major 6. I'm not going to do that here. I prefer, again, working in chromatic just to have the flexibility, and I have a pretty good understanding of music theory, so I'm comfortable working in chromatic. But you see the amount of shift that happens there. So we're actually moving a lot of these words or syllables to the note. And we see here, for example, the A, the center of the A right here is actually going to be in the center of this row, so to speak, right here. So it would be between the top and bottom of this white part right here. And like I said, the actual pitch itself is the red line right here. So just by doing the coarse action right here with the macro, this is what it now sounds like. I'll actually mute the vocal harmonies here.
All around us is the drug takers playing with the salt shakers, one is for all. Y'all thinking you're different.
So that sounds a little bit better than if I have Melodyne off.
All around us is the drug takers playing with the salt shakers, one is for all. Y'all thinking you're different.
So it just helps to tighten it up a little bit, and then I could go through and utilize the pitch tool right here, either the pitch tool itself, the pitch modulation tool, or the pitch drift tool. So the pitch tool itself, I can actually move this up a few cents or actually drag it to different notes.
All around us is the drug takers.
So obviously I wouldn't want to do something that extreme, but I can go in and fine tune in terms of cents right here in this part, or I can drag it up and down. And then with the pitch modulation tool, I can flatten out the modulation, reverse it, and just work Melodyne to really finesse the actual pitch of the note right here. I may want to affect these right here so that this peaks at the center line right here of the A note. And again, I would work in small chunks like this throughout the entirety of the song to tune the entirety of the vocal. This is, of course, just scratching the surface. There's a whole lot more we can do with Melodyne, but this is not a detailed demo of Melodyne. I just wanted to show you quickly how I would go about using this in a very broad sense on vocals. We can also use Melodyne on polyphonic instruments. So for example, if I was to record some guitar here and have things a little bit out of tune as they are now, let's make the D particularly out of tune. So if I was to record, that's particularly bad, but if we were to slap a Melodyne on here and record this, and make sure that the algorithm now is set to polyphonic rather than melodic, then we could see here that it is picking up an E, and then this is grossly out of tune. That's supposed to be a G sharp, a major third. Then we have the D, which is the major 7, and then the 9 right here. So I could even go as far as deleting one of these, but for now, let's just select these, go up here, pitch center, and you see that it drug those notes up to the appropriate note. And now if we have a listen here, that sounds much more like a proper major 9 chord right here and then a major 7 chord right here. And the artifacts don't sound absolutely gross on this. It actually sounds pretty good. Versus having it off. So a super powerful plugin, whether we want to use it on monophonic instruments or polyphonic instruments. Just wanted to bring out the guitar to show you quickly how I would go about using Melodyne on polyphonic instruments. Another really cool thing about Melodyne before we move on is I can go to settings right here, save as MIDI, and I will call this just MIDI test. Save that, and then I can go back to my Finder right here, grab MIDI test, perhaps move this to a new track, not import the tempo, and then I can have this play on a different instrument with MIDI. So if I zoom in right here, you see that we have that E major 7 chord right here with the E, G sharp, D sharp, and F sharp. And the velocity has been carried over as well. Just another really cool feature to be able to take the information in audio, have Melodyne identify all of the notes and pitch correct them, and then output that as MIDI so that we can run it in our virtual instruments. It's not quite as good as having a proper MIDI guitar, but it is a very cool feature that I underutilize, but would like to use more with Melodyne. All right, the second plugin I have to share with you today is the Synchro Arts VocAlign. In this case, I'm using the Ultra version. This is, again, the top of the line version. There are other editions for you to choose from, but I like the full feature one right here, even though I don't use all of its functionality. Basically, what this plugin allows me to do is save a tremendous amount of time aligning vocals or other instruments together, whether that is aligning background vocals to each other, aligning them to the lead vocal, or aligning other instruments together to make things sound more cohesive and more professional in the mix. So right here we have a guide track, which is what we want this track to align to. So in this case, I have VocAlign Ultra set on Vox Harms 1. So this is the harmony track, the first harmony track. And what I want to do is align that to the lead vocal right here. And so what I'm going to do is this guide, the sidechain, that's going to be what I want to match the timing of this vocal to. So I'm going to go up to sidechain, choose Vox lead right here. And then I'm going to click capture right here in order to arm the plugin right here. And then while I'm at it, I'm just going to copy this over to the other three harmony tracks right here, like so. In Logic, that is just holding down Option and dragging. And then I'm going to arm all of these like that. And then I'm going to play this section.
All around us is the drug
You see that things are recording on each of these.
If I'm getting twisted, pull it, pass it.
And there is an ARA version of this where you could just hit the play button and it would capture all of the audio. But again, I'm not showing you that for this demonstration. And you can see here in the plugin itself, we have the guide right here. We have the actual audio of the track that this plugin is inserted on. And then we have an output right here. And if we were to zoom in a little bit, you see that the blue outline right here is actually the guide track. And then the yellow is the resulting alteration of the audio so that it will fit timing wise to the guide track. And so we are stretching things out, we're moving things around automatically in order to turn this dub track into the output track right here in yellow. So for example, right here, the very last line is stretched out a little bit and things are moved around timing wise right here. Things aren't always going to be perfect. There's often times where I have to actually go into the audio tracks and finesse things around a little bit, whether that's altering the timing or stretching or compressing the audio, but this will save me a ton of time versus having to do all of that on the audio file itself. So just to show, let's exit out of these quickly. You can see that these are still working and we can have a listen with and without the VocAlign Ultra on. So this is with it on.
All around us is the drug takers playing with us all, shakers want us for all. Y'all thinking you do.
And this is with it off.
All around us is the drug takers playing with us all, shakers want us for all. Y'all thinking you do.
So it's very subtle, but it does help to tie things together a little bit and make it sound a bit more professional. The vocalist did a really good job timing each of the harmonies in this. It's just one vocalist with all of these harmonies. But if there are little discrepancies, rather than going in and having to chop things up, move around the vocals, time compress and time expand the audio itself, I can easily just throw on the VocAlign Ultra and move on with the mix. So again, not a super in-depth demonstration. I'm trying to get through each of these plugins in an effective manner, but I think that the VocAlign Ultra is a super powerful plugin if you'd like to save time in aligning vocals and other instruments. I've had a lot of success with this on vocals and particularly on horns, although you can try it on whatever you'd like in your mixes. All right, the next plugin I have to show you is actually a suite of plugins. It is the iZotope RX bundle. I happen to have the standard version, although I have used the advanced version when I was working on a few television programs. It is a great audio restoration tool. You see we have RX10 breath control, connect, declick, declip, decrackle, de-ess, de-hum, deplosive, de-reverb, guitar denoise, mouth declick, music rebalance, repair assistant, spectral denoise, spectral editor, voice denoise. And all of these can be used in different instances to help restore relatively poor recordings. You can see in my home studio here, it's just in a bedroom in my house. I don't have perfect HVAC systems. I don't have floating rooms. And while I do live out in the woods, I do still get a little bit of construction noise here and there or traffic noise. And so my recordings aren't always perfect. There's often hum, for example, or maybe I'll do a vocal take and there's some plosives in it. Or maybe I'm recording in this room and although there is acoustic treatment, there's just a little bit too much room noise or reverb in the signal. I can utilize these plugins to help restore the audio and make it the best it can sound before getting into the mix. And so, for example, we could go to deplosive right here, and I don't believe there's actually any plosives on the lead vocal here, but we can have a listen.
All around us is the drug takers playing with the salt shakers, one is for all, y'all thinking you're different. All around us is the drug takers playing with the salt shakers, one.
Yeah, so there's no plosive on that P there, but if there were nasty plosives, I would use something like the RX deplosive to get in there and fix that, or at least mitigate it a little bit in the mix so that it's not as detrimental to the mix. Likewise, if I had recorded this vocal without the acoustic treatment in this room, perhaps I could have used the RX10 here to help reduce some of that reverb within the signal. So again, not a full demonstration. Perhaps I'll do a full video on the RX Advanced or the RX Standard in the future, but this is one of my favorite plugins before getting into the mix. All right, I've got the guitar back out to talk about another one of my favorite plugins. This is the Archetype Nolly from NeuralDSP. It's got 4 different amps with their respective cabinets right here. We can also mix and match the amps and cabinets. These are all great sounding amps. I just have my guitar plugged directly into my interface and there's no other plugins on. And it sounds like this. So great right out of the box. We've got gain control, EQ control right here as a typical amplifier would, master, resonance, presence, level, and a bunch of different cabs and amplifiers to choose from right here. We've also got pedals if I wanted a compressor. We've got delay. 2 overdrives. And really great if you want to do heavier stuff. I really like producing heavier style music. And it's not just great on guitars. I use this on other instruments all the time. So we've got the pedals, we've got the amps, we've got an EQ right here, a graphic EQ. We've also got a cab sim right here, where again, we can choose from different cabinets as well. And we've got 2 different microphones with 2 different speakers right here. We can adjust the position, the distance, the level, whether we want to use 2 mics or not. In this case, we have emulations of the SM57, the MD421, the C414, and then the Ribbon 160. I believe that's a Bayer Dynamic. Yeah, looks like it. And I know a lot of people don't like amp sims. They would much prefer set up their amplifier. And I do enjoy setting up my amp and miking it up and getting the tone I want, running all my pedals through it. But an amp sim allows me to plug directly into my interface, not make any noise in my spare room right here in my house. And the Archetype Nolly happens to be my personal go-to, my favorite amp sim. The next plugin I have to share is another from NeuralDSP. This is the Darkglass Ultra, which is an emulation of the classic pedal from Darkglass Electronics. This is great on bass guitar, although I do use it on a bunch of other instruments as well, particularly bass style synths. And so I don't have a bass guitar in my possession at this moment, so I'm just gonna run this through a virtual instrument, the Ample Bass P Lite. And without the Darkglass on, this is kind of what it sounds like. And then with it just in stock mode, I haven't messed around with any of the settings. So quite a bit of grit, quite a bit of drive. We have the entire pedal right here. We can choose between 2 different models, the B7U and the VDU. That one's a little bit more in your face. And then much like the Archetype Nolly and most other NeuralDSP plugins, as far as I'm aware, we also have beautiful cab emulation right here. And we have 2 microphones that we can position around each of these speakers. We actually have quite a few different mics right here versus the Nolly, and then a custom IR as well if we'd like it. And so if we go back to the pedal here, we have a whole bunch of controls that we can mess about with. I usually like bringing the low mid centered around 1K. I like to turn down the drive probably in this case. We can choose between having distortion on or distortion off. And then if we turn the plugin off, And what I love about this plugin is not only that we have tone control with or without distortion, but it can really actually make rather robotic sounding instruments, virtual instruments, sound more realistic. And so even when I'm using virtual instruments for my bass guitar, I'll often run them through the Darkglass Ultra. And especially in denser mixes, this helps it sound much more like a real bass guitar. So it is one of my go-to plugins, not only on bass, but because this is designed for bass, I figured I would show it to you running a virtual bass instrument through it. All right, and now we are into a mix that I did for a client here to talk about the next plugin. This is the Waves SSL E-Channel. This is my go-to channel strip plugin. As you can see in this mix, for example, I have it on pretty much every single channel that has audio on it. And I kind of treat this, especially when I'm mixing, as a sort of input, as if I'm using an actual mixer. In this case, an analog mixer. Things are very nicely laid out in this plugin. And just quickly, we have the EQ section on the left-hand side, and then the dynamics section on the right-hand side. You can see it labeled filters and dynamics right here. We've got our low cut filter or high pass filter right here. We have our low pass or high cut filter right here. We've got a high frequency control right here. This can be either a shelf or a bell, depending on whether we toggle this. We have high mid frequencies right here. This is a parametric band where we have control over the gain, over the center frequency, and also over the Q value. We also have the same thing here for the low mid frequencies, and then we have the low frequencies right here, which can also be set up as a shelf or a bell with this button right here. We have a nice compressor right here, complete with ratio, threshold, a knob for release control, and then a toggle between fast and slow attack. And then we also have an expander right here, which can also be doubled as a gate, whether or not we select the gate option right here. We can either choose the dynamics to be before or after the EQ. We can bypass either of them. We have this analog option right here, which introduces a sort of analog noise to the output of the plugin. We have a polarity flip right here, an input gain and an output gain. So basically everything we need in a channel strip. It may seem basic, but it is super powerful. And beyond the sound of the plugin itself, what I really like about the SSL E-Channel strip right here is that I don't have a whole lot of visual feedback. I do, of course, have my expansion and my compression LED strips right here, but I don't have any frequency analyzer for the EQ. And so this helps me to mix more with my ears rather than my eyes. And it just keeps me on my toes and makes sure that I'm making decisions based upon what I'm hearing rather than what I'm seeing in the mix. So this is my go-to channel strip. I would highly recommend you check it out for yourself, or any channel strip for that matter that doesn't offer a whole bunch of visual feedback, again, to help you mix with your ears rather than your eyes. All right, seemingly in direct contrast to what I was just talking about, we have the Pro-Q3. I think this is everybody's favorite EQ plugin, mine included. It has a very detailed analyzer right here. We have pre, post, we can freeze things, we can EQ match, we can view the sidechain, we can see external spectrums from other instruments to compare and contrast. So there's a lot that we can look at here, but at the risk of mixing with our eyes rather than our ears, this is a super powerful plugin that I love using, especially for troubleshooting and for sweetening. And so we have a bunch of different bands, and everyone is fully parametric. We can just double click to add new bands at will. And we have a whole bunch of different types to choose from right here. We have bell, low shelf, low cut, high shelf, high cut, notch, bandpass, tilt shelf, flat tilt. We've got a whole bunch of different slopes to choose from, and we can move each of these around at will like this. We've got frequency down here, gain, Q values, and we can choose on a per band basis whether we want to affect the stereo, just the left channel, just the right channel, just the mid channel, just the side channel. We can also on a per band basis opt to utilize dynamic EQ if we would like to. And on a holistic note, we can choose from zero latency, natural phase, or even linear phase. This is a super powerful plugin. I like using it for aggressive EQ moves. For example, if we go here and I wanted to have a low cut at a brick wall right here, I could do so. And if I wanted a very thin notch to just reduce a very specific frequency, I could do so as well, like so. Bring that Q down like that. Just make things super narrow. And I can do this with, again, linear phase or zero latency or natural phase. So just a super powerful EQ plugin. It can do basically anything you want it to do. And it is certainly a go-to plugin in my repertoire. The next one of my favorite plugins is the Waves SSL Comp. This is modeled after the Solid State Logic G Master bus compressor. I love using this on my subgroups and on my mix bus. In the case of this mix, I used it on the drum bus right here. You see it's a compressor. We have threshold, makeup gain, attack, release, ratio controls. Also, we have that analog button if we want to add in a little bit of noise to the signal. And I love this stereo compressor. It just really helps to glue things together and make things sound more cohesive in the mix. That's why I love using it on the drum bus in particular, and also on the mix bus. So if we have a listen to the drum subgroup, I will A/B this for you. We're just touching it, not even getting 4 dB of gain reduction. This is it off. So it's very subtle, just helps to tie things together. And then if we have a look at the mix bus over here, I also have it on the mix bus. Again, very subtle, just helping to tie things together. Just barely touching it there on the mix bus, but again, it just helps to tie things together a little bit and make the mix sound a little bit more cohesive. I do have a video going into detail on glue and whether or not you may want to even have glue in your mix, or if you'd like more separation in your mix. It all depends on what you're going for, but if you do want glue, I really highly recommend the SSL Comp from Waves here. Now, when it comes to compressors, I will often utilize the stock compressor within Logic. If I bring that up quickly under Dynamics Compressor, we actually have a few different algorithms to choose from: Studio VCA, Studio FET, Classic VCA, Vintage VCA, Vintage FET, Vintage Opto. This Vintage FET is actually modeled after an 1176, but when I do want an 1176 emulation, I will typically go for the CLA76 from Waves right here. As the name would suggest, this is modeled after Chris Lord Alge's 1176s. We have 2 revisions, the Bluey and the Blackie. I really like how fast and snappy this compressor is. I like using it to really slam vocals and bring them to the forefront of the mix. And I also like it for shaping the sound of snares. And so in terms of the revisions, the Bluey is a little bit more aggressive. This is it on the lead vocal. I will turn it on and off to A/B test it.
Why do you take me in and leave me on the ground? Surrounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make.
So it's not completely level matched, but you hear it kind of jump out of the speakers a little bit. At least I hear that in the headphones I'm wearing. And then we can also hear it on the snare over here. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail on each of these plugins to try to make this video relatively short. You see I have the less aggressive Blackie version on the snare top right here.
When you're lying inside of me, feels so right. Why can't you see me like you saw?
It just helps that snare stand out a little bit more. So these 1176 emulation plugins don't often sound exactly like the hardware. And while I would love to have a few 1176s in my studio as hardware, I will have to settle for the plugins for now. And this is my go-to 1176 FET plugin. Next up, we have another FabFilter plugin. This is the Pro-L2. This is my go-to limiter, particularly on mastering or on the mix bus when I'm ready to export and reference my mixes outside the studio. It's great for maximizing loudness, and it's another super powerful plugin. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to bring the output level down so that I'm matching the amount of gain that I have over here. So let's bring this to -8. We have our gain control right here, so we can bring our gain up and then limit at the top. We've got a bunch of different algorithms: transparent, punchy, dynamic, all around, aggressive, modern, bus, and safe. We've got a look ahead control right here. And as is the case with FabFilter plugins, we do have this handy help bubble that will populate up here if we hover over here. So for example, the look ahead knob sets how quickly Pro-L2 responds to sudden peaks in the audio signal. With shorter look ahead times, you can achieve greater loudness at the cost of possible distortion. We also have attack and release controls right here, as well as channel linking. These are the advanced controls. We've got oversampling all the way up to 32x. Now that I have an M2 Max Mac Studio, I would feel comfortable using these CPU intensive oversamplings. If we do want to alter the bit depth, we do have dither options. And if we turn that on, we have a bunch of different noise shaping algorithms to choose from here. I'll turn that off for this case. And we have a handy meter over here with loudness target. So for example, if I wanted to go to streaming, I could set the target as -14. If I wanted to go to CD, I could set a target at -9 LUFS. And I can also meter short-term, momentary, or integrated LUFS. I have the timeline right here to show how much I am limiting at any given point, so I can adjust my gain and make sure that I'm not pushing things too hard into distortion, while also being able to maximize the loudness. I can turn on and off true peak limiting as well. So super powerful plugin, and it's super easy to use and get in and get that loudness maximization that we want. That might actually be a bit too much. And again, this is just the mix. I'm not actually mastering here. And so I wanted to show you how I would go about using Pro-L2, but I'm not going to spend the time in this video to go through and actually set the settings as I normally would. Another limiter that I really enjoy using is the L1 from Waves. As you can see, it's quite a bit different from the Pro-L2. We do have a modern view. I've been using this one for a while, so I like the legacy view here. And it's very simple. We have a threshold control, an out ceiling, and a release. We can also toggle on auto release if we'd like to. And what I like about this plugin is that it's super simple, and I like using it on vocals and also on buses to help give me a maximum peak limit in order to increase the headroom without necessarily altering the perceived loudness of a track. And so in this case, I wanted the vocal to sit at a very specific level. And so I put the L1 limiter directly on it, and we can have a look and listen to what this sounds like here.
Why do you take me in and then leave me
Just barely hitting it there.
Surrounded by the weight of your words, the sounds you make when.
So I'm just touching it, but as I'm attenuating it about 3 dB or so, I'm stopping it from being 3 dB louder without necessarily altering the perceived loudness of the signal. So this isn't a masterclass on limiting per se, but I do really enjoy these two limiters in particular, and they are regularly used in my mixing and my mastering. Another go-to Waves plugin I like using is the simple DeEsser. Much like the L1, it's got a very nice, simple interface. We've got audio split versus wideband. We've got our center frequency and sidechain, and we can monitor the audio or the sidechain itself, and then just a simple threshold control to control the amount of sibilance. And so if you're unfamiliar with what a DeEsser does, is it's basically a multiband compressor that acts to duck the sibilance or the S sounds in the vocal whenever they are overly present and overly harsh. In the case of this mix, I pushed the high end of the vocal a little bit too hot, and so I wanted to bring that back, dial it down with some de-essing. And so the frequency right here is a little bit high. Usually I would go around 5K. In this case, I'm at 9K. We can have a listen to the difference. It's going to be subtle between having this on and off.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground?
I'll loop that right here. Turn it off.
Why do you take me in?
So the T on the take is quite harsh.
Why do you take me in?
And then this de-esser helps to tame that. You see the amount of attenuation that happens right there. So this is it off.
Why do you take me?
So that's pretty harsh.
Why do you take me in?
That's nice and tamed. And so it doesn't drop the entire level of the vocal at that particular point, but it does help to tame that initial transient of the word take in this instance. There are plenty of de-essers on the market. You can also utilize dynamic EQ or multiband compression to get the same results, but I really like the simplicity of the Waves de-esser right here and the ability to change the frequency to what you specifically need in your mix and to quickly dial something in to tame those sibilants in especially vocals, but we can also use it in other instruments. If you're enjoying this video thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button. It really helps out small channels like this on YouTube. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Next up, we have my go-to saturation plugin. It is the Saturn 2 from FabFilter. All of FabFilter plugins I love. This one is no exception. And what I like about this one is that it has a whole bunch of different algorithms to choose from tube, tape, amp simulations, even regular saturation, transformer saturation, which we don't often get in saturation plugins. And then we also have some effects to really destroy the audio signal. We have a simple drive control right here, feedback, tone, the level, and the wet dry mix right here. And on top of that, we have multi-band saturation with this one, where we can opt to get multiple bands and saturate each of them independently from one another. So in total, we can get 6 bands right here. Usually I'll only opt for a single one or maybe 2 in specific cases where I want the low end to be saturated differently. But what I really like about this plugin is the way that it sounds. And so I'll often use this on vocals, on drums, on guitars, even on the mix bus and in mastering. To demo this, I figured I would just play back the drum subgroup and make some adjustments on the Saturn II. So let's have a listen to the drums in the chorus and fiddle around with the Saturn II here. Off. So it's subtle even when we're driving it quite dramatically. We can have a listen to what the tape sounds like. Helps to glue things together, make things sound a bit more cohesive. Let's see what it sounds like when we go through an amp here. We can get some interesting effects. We can also adjust the wet-dry mix here. Maybe rectify it. Usually I'll stick to tape or tube, but we do have a whole bunch of different algorithms to play around with. And so again, I like to use the Saturn II on pretty much everything within the mix. It is my go-to saturation plugin, and I wanted to show you quickly what it sounds like in this video. So I'm a big fan of distortion and saturation in mixing and music production. The next plugin I have to show you is the Decapitator from Soundtoys. This one's been around for quite some time. It's got 5 different algorithms to choose from. I can't quite remember exactly what they are. I believe the A is an Ampex model. Can't quite remember what the E is. The N, I believe, is a Neve. The T is a triode, and the P is a pentode tube. We've got drive that is automatically linked to the output right here. We've got low cut tone control between dark and bright, a high cut, a built-in mix, so we can use parallel saturation or distortion right here, and then this punish mode right here, which really drives everything up. And so we can have a listen to what this sounds like again on the drum bus here. The different algorithms sound quite a bit different. A lot of the low end thump in this one. You can do some parallel processing here and hit that punish button. So I like utilizing this in parallel mode right here, where I'll drive it pretty hard and then only mix it in subtly underneath just to add a little bit more grit and character. Or I'll like to use it with the drive relatively low just to add a little bit of harmonic saturation to a signal. I like using it on the drum bus, I like using it on individual drums, and I like using it on vocals and lead instruments in particular. I think clipping is an overlooked process in music production and mixing, often because we're told to avoid clipping at all costs on the mix bus or the master bus to avoid that digital clipping, but it can be a super useful process to help shave off the tops of our waveforms and maintain the sense of punchiness while still bringing down the peak levels to help us get a little bit more headroom. And it can also be used as an effective distortion as well. And so there are plenty of clipper plugins on the market. I personally opted for the StandardCLIP as my first clipping plugin, and I haven't really tried out many others, so this is my favorite by default, but it is still a great plugin. I often will use it again on the drum bus, but I'll also use it on individual drums. I find that clipping can often lead to too much distortion on bass elements like the kick drum, but we can often get away with pretty significant clipping on things like the snare drum to bring down the peak level without affecting its overall perceived loudness and also giving it a little bit more character and grit. So I'll just briefly go over and toggle the StandardCLIP on and off and just move the clipping threshold right here for you. Just getting a little bit of clipping right here. We see that we are clipping at -8.1, and if I turn this off, sounds pretty much the same, maybe even quieter, and we're clipping above that -8.1. If I bring this down, we can get that distortion, if that's what we're going for. Usually I just use it to get a little bit more headroom in the mix, like so, where you don't really hear it all that much. To reiterate, I do like clipping. I think it's super useful, and the StandardCLIP is my go-to in that regard. I wasn't lying when I said I like saturation and distortion. Another one of my favorite go-to plugins is the black box analog design HG2. This one's from Plugin Alliance. And when I'm not using the Saturn II, I'll often reach for this one to get a little bit of tube style saturation. So we have the pentode control over here and the triode control over here. And let's have a listen to what these sound like. You have to be careful of the output. You can add a little bit of air with that. Too much air on those drums. Too much distortion on the kick, but can just add a little bit more grit, particularly to drums. But again, I don't only use this on drums. I'll often use it on vocals and other instruments just to give them a little bit more color. This is more of a saturation plugin than necessarily a distortion plugin. We're not going to completely obliterate the signal, usually with the HG2, but it is a great plugin to get a little bit of that tube style saturation to a sound, again, with the pentode setting over here and the triode setting over here. Next up on my list is yet another distortion plugin. This is Ravage from Soundspot, and rather than putting it on the drum bus, I figured I would put it on the stock E-Piano from Logic. So this is what it sounds like without any distortion. And what I like to use this distortion plugin for is to really destroy and mangle a sound and kind of get a new instrument out of what I'm working with. So here is the piano by itself. And then if I turn on Ravage, even with the drive at 30, and it's got 6 different algorithms to choose from. We can go digital, tube, diode, linear fold, zero square, rectify. And they all sound different and give a different distortion, especially when we're messing about with the drive here. So if I was to turn this all the way up, for example, let's turn the output down a little bit. And then beyond that, we have this destroy knob over here, which I believe turns up a lot of the feedback. So let's turn the output down even more. And you hear that feedback as the virtual instrument kind of dies out. We also have this movement tab right here, which we can mess about with. I don't often use the movement tab, but it is a little something else to pay attention to within this plugin. So it's fairly simple, but it offers a lot. I'll often use it to actually get a different tone out of an instrument, whether that's in the mix and I'm using it in parallel to help add some extra interest, or when I'm producing music to get a new, unique sound out of a virtual instrument like this keyboard, my guitar, a sample, or anything else. Now that we've got our virtual electric piano set up, I figured I would talk a little bit more about my time-based effects that I like using. The first of which is the EchoBoy from Soundtoys. This is another Soundtoys plugin. I really like their stuff, and the EchoBoy is a go-to delay unit of mine. Usually I'll use just the stock stereo delay of Logic, but anytime I want something a little special, I will often reach for the EchoBoy. You can see here we have a whole bunch of classics to choose from, including the Memory Man, Space Echo, Echoplex, DM2, but we've also got a whole bunch of different stuff to choose from. Just stock out of the box, it sounds like this. And if we go into the controls right here, we have the classic dry wet mix. I have this directly on the inserts of this piano just for demo purposes. Usually I would set this up as an effects return and go all the way wet, but for the demonstration here, I'm just going to keep this around 50%. We've got echo time, so we can choose to sync that to the tempo of 148 right here. Let's go maybe half note. We have feedback, all standard stuff. We have high cut and low cut for the actual delay itself. We can groove it, so we can shuffle or swing. We can rush it or drag it behind the tempo that is set by the DAW, or we can tap things out if we really wanted to. The single echo, dual echo, ping pong, rhythmic echo, there's a whole bunch of different stuff we can utilize in here and actually go in and customize the levels of these echoes if we'd like, or move them around. There's a whole lot we can do. Of course, we can go to the classics again and choose something like the Echoplex, for example. Another classic like the Memory Man. And speaking of the Memory Man, if I don't want to go through the EchoBoy and I want something a little bit closer to the classics, because the EchoBoy is sort of a all-purpose delay, I can actually go in to my audio units, and I like a few delays from Arturia, the first of which is the Brigade. So this is actually a emulation of the Memory Man from Electro Harmonics, and it actually looks very similar here. We can unlink the right and left delay if we'd like. We can sync them to the tempo of the track. Adjust the feedback. Adjust to the bucket Brigade device size right here, from the Deluxe to the 1100. So that one's a little shorter. Stereo offset, stereo width, the amount of chorus or vibrato. We can adjust from ping pong or mid-side. And the blend, of course. So if I want a nice analog delay, I will often choose the Delay Brigade from Arturia. And if I want a tape style delay, particularly one that is emulated after the Roland 201 Space Echo, I will go back to Arturia to delay tape 201. And this is a beautiful recreation of that delay right here. So we can get some nice tape delay with this one. And what I like about the tape delay is modulating this time right here. Just get that classic tape delay modulation effect right there. We have ping pong and mid-side here as well. I'm really feeling D-Lydian today, so it seems. We can adjust the intensity and even the amount of reverb as well. So just a beautiful tape style delay, again emulating the classic Roland Space Echo, and this is one of my go-to delays. So we talked about delays. The other time-based effect that we use is reverb. And when it comes to plate reverb, I really like the little plate from Soundtoys. This is pretty much my go-to reverb when I'm not using the convolution reverb that is stock in Logic. This is an EMT 140 emulation. Arturia, which we were just discussing, does have a great plugin like this, but I prefer the Soundtoys right here. It's super simple. We've got the decay in seconds. We've got the mix between dry and wet, a low cutoff, and a mod option right here to control whether we want a bit of modulation or not. I will often use the little plate on vocals or especially snare drums as my snare reverb, but for demo purposes, we'll have a listen to what it sounds like on this E-piano. That's 100% wet. Bring it to about 50%. We can really draw it out. All the way wet. Another one of my favorite reverbs, again, if I'm not using the convolution reverb that is stock in Logic, is the Softube spring reverb. And what I really like about this plugin, first off, is that we can actually shake the spring as if we're hitting a real guitar amp spring, which is pretty cool. We can adjust the tension, and we can go continuously between 1 to 3 springs right here. Now with a spring reverb, I pretty much only use this on guitars. Guitar amplifiers have a rich history with spring reverb, and so I will typically utilize this as a guitar reverb. But again, for the purposes of demonstration, I'll play the E-piano through this reverb for you. We have tone controls right here. Three springs, maybe. We can decrease the tension to really hear the slap of that spring on the transient. So it's not something I would necessarily use on E-piano. I would, again, use it on guitars, but the spring reverb from Softube is definitely one of my go-to reverb plugins. Another one of my go-to plugins is yet another one from Soundtoys. It's called the Little AlterBoy. This is designed, I think, primarily for vocals, but I like using it elsewhere. We have a pitch control. It's effectively an octave up or octave down pitch shifter. We can also shift the formants or link the pitch and formants right here. There are 3 different modes: transpose, quantize, and robot. And then we also have the drive right here and a wet dry mix control right here. And so let's have a listen to the dry E-piano in this case. Now if I turn this mix all the way up, we have the same thing, but we can adjust the pitch right here. And use this effectively as a tone control. And this is typically how I'll use this, just as a way to get weird and wacky sounds and sort of rely on it for happy accidents in my music production. Especially when you're feeding multiple notes into it, you can get a lot of weird stuff. Versus 1 note at a time, 2 notes at a time, 3 notes. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can actually do with this plugin, and it's actually got a really nice drive function right here. So it sounds really good just as a distortion plugin by itself. We've got a few different modes worth trying out. And so you can use it as a real pitch shifting plugin, particularly on vocals, but I don't usually use it like that. You see here that it's little AlterBoy monophonic voice manipulation, but I like using it on other instruments in order to get a little bit of some wacky sounds with it right here. If I was to go and try it out on, say, the lead vocal right here, I'll put it at the very end. We can have a listen to what this sounds like. Let's say we want to pitch it up an octave, and I will link the formants. I'll turn the drive all the way down, the wet mix all the way up. Or all the way down. So it actually sounds pretty good as a monophonic voice manipulation plugin. We can get that octave down or that octave up, but it's one of my favorite plugins because of the wackiness that I can get out of it on other instruments within the mix. Another cool plugin that gives me interesting effects and that I really like messing around with is the EFX Fragments, another one from Arturia. This is a granular type plugin, so there's a lot going on in the resynthesis of the grains that you're sending into it. I would have to do some research and put together a full-length video to explain granular resynthesis, but it's something that I like to mess about with just to get some interesting textures and atmospheres in the music production that I'm working on. And so again, the E-piano just dry is like this. And then running it through EFX Fragments, we can get something like. There's a whole bunch of different presets we can choose from here. Delay, distortion, filter, modulation. Let's try decomposition, for example. And a bunch of different parameters we can control here. The wet dry mix, so we can have 100% grains or 100% the original sound. Let's try something else here. Maybe classic eighths repeats. Maybe a unique shimmer. Just a whole bunch of cool stuff. You heard just from the presets there how different all of these presets can be and how vast this plugin can be. And so it's something that I like to mess around. I don't necessarily know exactly what I'm doing with it, but a great way to get in and get some new interesting atmospheres and textures within your mixes. Next up, we have the LFOTool from Xfer Records. This is a great plugin. I like using it for pumping, and I believe a lot of people like utilizing this plugin rather than having to go through the trouble of setting up sidechain compression. I find that this plugin, we can do a lot more and we can really dial in the sort of EDM pumping that we would typically get from sidechain compression. So this plugin ties into the tempo of the mix, and it only works when the actual timeline is being played through. So if I played just a blank section of the song here and then played around with the E-piano in real time, we could have something like this. So it's pumping at a rate of a quarter note. I can make that deeper. I could adjust the rate here. So we could use it as a sort of tremolo style effect as well. Into the audio range. or get that classic pumping that we want. We can trigger it on each note. We can use note gate, velocity to PWM. There's a whole bunch of LFO routing we can do. I usually use it for the simple pumping effect right here, but there is a whole lot more to it. And I would highly suggest you check out the LFOTool from Xfer Records if you're into electronic music and you want something to give you a little bit of stuttering effect or tremolo or pumping. This is a super easy way to do it, and it's super customizable as well. Next up on my list of favorite plugins is the Waves Doubler. It comes in two different plugins, the Doubler 2, which effectively duplicates the signal twice, and the Doubler 4, which duplicates it 4 times. And what doubler effects do in general is they aim to recreate the effect of double tracking, where we will record a musician performing a performance and then re-record that performance as close to the original as possible, and then mix the two together. And while we can get the timing and the tuning pretty much perfectly in those two takes, there will be subtle differences in the phase between those two tracks, and when we mix them together, we can get some additional width, some additional depth, and some additional character to the sound. And so doubling effects, the doubler from Waves, for example, my preferred doubler plugin, allows us to duplicate the direct signal and then toggle it on and off. We can also pan and alter the gain of the direct signal. And then with the duplicates, we have voice 1 and voice 2, which we can also alter the gain with. And then we have control over the panning. So -45 is hard pan to the left, +45 is hard pan to the right. We have delay with feedback for that delay. And then we have detune, so we can detune a amount of cents. And then we have depth and rate in order to give some vibrato to those duplicates. And so by panning, delaying, detuning, and then modulating these duplicate signals, we will alter the phase relationships between the direct and the duplicates in order to get that increased width, depth, and character that I was talking about earlier. It's not the same as true double tracking, and in my opinion doesn't give us as good results, but when we're using this on background instruments and background vocals, I find it's a great way to add character and add dimensionality to the vocals. So in the case of this song, I had one background vocal in the choruses and the verses to work with, and what I did was I put a doubler on it. I got rid of the direct mono signal, and then I had a hard pan version on the left and a hard pan version on the right. And you can see here I have delay of 3.6 on the first voice, 14.8 milliseconds on the second voice, detune of +6 cents on the first and -6 cents on the second. And if I was to solo this and have a listen back, we can hear the first line without any doubling, and then I will turn it on for the second line.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground?
Doubling on.
Grounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make when...
And then if I was to add this in with the lead vocal, we can hear it sort of hugging the lead vocal, being to the left and the right, with the lead vocal panned directly to the center.
No, why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground?
And then without doubling.
Grounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make when...
So just add some dimensionality, some character, and some width to the vocals and to the overall mix. We don't necessarily have to use doubling like this. This is just one use case that I really like using doubling with, but I hope that you can see the power in doubling and why I enjoy the Waves Doubler so much. Next up, we have another bass plugin for me to show you. I'm going to be running, again, the Ample Bass P Lite into this. I will mute the R bass, and this is what the bass sounds like. And what the R bass does is it takes all of the information below this cutoff and adds saturation to it in an attempt to increase the presence of the audio. And so we're effectively adding harmonic content to the signal based upon the information below, in this case, 121 Hertz. And this allows bass elements to be better perceived in the mid-range on smaller speakers and in headphones without necessarily adding distortion to the signal. Of course, we are distorting the signal by adding this harmonic content, but it doesn't necessarily sound harsh like it. So again, without the R bass on, and with, I can turn up the intensity here, off, on, and we can bring this frequency down a bit even. So it just helps to bring out the presence of bass instruments, especially that have information below whatever this cutoff is, and make them more present in the mix. It's a relatively simple plugin to use, although it can be complicated to explain and to fully understand, but it's a go-to plugin for me when I'm dealing with bass elements that aren't necessarily translating all that well into small speakers and to speakers more broadly, and I want more presence in the bass. All right, I moved into a proper mastering session that I have on the go right here in order to talk about the last 3 plugins on my favorites list. The first of which is the Ozone 10 from iZotope. This is the advanced version, and this is basically an all-in-one mastering plugin. We have a whole bunch of modules to choose from here: dynamic EQ, dynamics or a compressor, 2 equalizers, an exciter or saturator, an imager, impact, low-end focus, master rebalance, match EQ, maximizer or limiter, spectral shaper, stabilizer, vintage comp, vintage EQ, vintage limiter, and vintage tape. And if you look over here, you can see that I'm actually using the StandardCLIP, the Saturn 2, and the Pro-L 2 that we discussed earlier. But in the Ozone 10, there are quite a few modules that I really like using in my masters and even in my mixes sometimes. And so if we look at this particular master, I can go through what I did quickly. First off, I have the imager, and in this case, I brought down the stereo width in the low end. You can see we have 4 bands right here, so it's a multi-band imager that effectively adjusts the phase differences between the left and right channel to offer more width. So I made the very low end more mono, I made the very top end more stereo, and then I did a little bit of finessing in the mid-range here. The impact is kind of like a transient shaper where we can dull or enhance the transients. I didn't do too much, but I did finesse, making the low mids a little bit more punchy, the high end a bit more punchy, and I actually brought down a little bit of the punchiness in the high mids right here. The exciter I actually didn't use in this because I like using the Saturn 2, and I actually got a little bit of distortion out of the clipper as well as the limiter. The equalizer right here I actually didn't use in this master, nor did I use the low-end focus. And the stabilizer right here is really cool. Ozone 10 actually has a data set of a bunch of songs in cinematic, country, EDM, folk, hip-hop, jazz, pop, reggae, R&B, soul, and rock, and it will actually use this data set and artificial intelligence to reference your frequency content against a bunch of songs in these genres and actually act dynamically to reshape the EQ of your song to help match it to those songs in those genres. And so we have shape, which will add boosting and cutting, or just cut, which will only cut away from your mix. And then we have the overall amount right here, the speed, sensitivity, and then effectively 3 bands down here. I have a video going into detail about my typical mastering chain. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below, and I talk a lot about the Ozone 10 in that video. But I will almost always use this when I'm mastering my own material and material for other people. And while I don't necessarily use it in my production and mixing sessions all that much, it does come in handy in some instances. All right, and the second last plugin I have to share with you today is the Reference 2 from Mastering the Mix. This is a superb plugin to use when you're mixing or when you're mastering to reference your reference tracks. So in the case of this session, I am mastering one of my own songs, and rather than opting for a third-party commercially released track and getting a copyright strike here on YouTube, I decided to reference my mix. So I'm actually referencing this file right here. However, the original, because the Reference 2 is inserted after all of my mastering plugins right here, will be effectively what's coming out of the Pro-L 2, and then the reference will be this track without any processing on it. And so right here I can go level match, match to quietest, and because this is starting at 1, I can basically mirror this and have it play back at the same. So I can level match and A/B test with the same levels, so there's no loudness bias, and hear the differences between what I did in the mix and any sweetening that I did in mastering. So here's the original. Here's the master. So just at a glance, I made the master a little less beefy in the low end, and I added a little bit more presence. This will help it to translate to many other playback systems, and I also widened it a little bit in the top end, narrowed it a little bit in the low end. So if I was using this in a mix, I would actually have a few different third-party reference mixes, either from a client or from myself. And you can actually add in several different reference tracks and then choose between them throughout your mixing session or your mastering session. And you can also go down here to Trinity Display and reference a level line, punch dots, stereo width, auto scale in terms of what this is going to be right here, +5 to -5 dB differences along the frequency spectrum right here. But it's just a fantastic plugin to give you some visual feedback and mostly just a nice A/B comparison with level matching between your mix and the reference mixes. All right, and finally, we have the Youlean Loudness Meter 2. There is a free version of this plugin. This right here is the paid version, and this is just a great metering plugin. It will give us short-term and integrated LUFS, the loudness range, real-time dynamics, average dynamics, momentary max, the real short-term max, and the true peak max. And I like using this at the very end of my mastering chain and my mix chain, just to make sure that I am outputting something that is appropriate to whatever I'm mastering to or mixing to. For example, if I was utilizing this FabFilter Pro-L2 limiter, which I typically will do, and I wasn't using any oversampling, it could be the case that I would have intersample peaking, and then it may or may not show up in this plugin itself. So the Youlean loudness meter would let me know if the true peak max was actually over what would otherwise be expected of my limiting plugin. Of course, the Pro-L2 has fantastic metering on its own, but this is just a safe backup to give me some more information about what's going on. So if I was to play something back here, you see that at that short period of the master, I have a short-term LUFS of -7.5 and integrated LUFS of -7.7. Of course, that is going to drop over the entirety of the song. You can actually see it in the waveform there. That's very quiet in this section, very loud in this section. And then you can see here that my true peak max is at -0.1 dB. And so this will not be digitally clipping. However, if I was to export this as a wave and then have it converted into MP3 for streaming, let's say, then that conversion would cause clipping. And so it's important to know that when you're mastering for different services. All right, so that is the last of my go-to favorite plugins for you. All right, if you've made it this far into the video, I would like to thank you very much for spending some time with me here on YouTube, especially if you've watched the entire video. I know this was a rather long one, and I would love to know what your favorite plugins are. And so if you could leave a comment in the comment section down below describing what your go-to plugins are, I would love to check them out. Maybe I've never heard of them before. Maybe I even have them and just haven't utilized them to their fullest potential. I'd love to hear what you think. And because this channel is relatively small, I do have time to go through and discuss with you in the comment section down below. So please leave a comment. And if you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. It goes through my entire framework from start to finish to help you make the right decisions at the right times in your mixes to get better results. So once again, it's the first link in the description box down below. You can sign up to my newsletter. I will send it to you right away. And if you'd like to spend even more time with me here on YouTube, I do have another few videos for you to check out. They will be in the top left and right corner. I would also invite you to hit that subscribe button if you'd like more information on music production here on the My New Microphone YouTube channel, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.